Morning, everyone. Virgo Triad here. It is July 30th, 2018, and we are almost 8 months into the year at this point. Today, we're going to be going over the top 10 craziest fringe theories of 2018. Number 10. The United States dollar has no real value. The power of the US dollar depends on its use as global currency. This itself is backed by a power of America's economy. Here are 3 reasons behind the power of the dollar, and they also explain why no other currency is going to quickly replace it. The dollar is a global currency. After World War II, the world's developed countries created a plan in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They fixed the rate of the exchange for all foreign currencies to the US dollar. The Bretton Woods Agreement promised that the United States would redeem any dollar for its value in gold. By the early 1970s, countries began demanding gold for their dollars to curb inflation. Rather than allow investors to deplete Fort Knox of all its gold reserves, President Nixon untied the dollar from gold. By that time, the dollar had become the world's dominant reserve currency. People like to talk about going back on a gold standard, but in essence, the dollar is like the gold standard. Most global contracts, especially those for oil, are denominated in dollars. Many large economies such as China, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Singapore peg their currency to the United States dollar. When the dollar weakens, so do the profits of their exporters. These countries also hold large deposits of United States treasuries. In theory, they could sell their holdings and perhaps cause a dollar collapse, but that's not in their best interest. Something that never seems to be discussed when talking about the collapse of the dollar is the fact that the dollar has always recovered from prior declines. The dollar declined during the 1970s, during the early 80s, and from about 91 to 93. During these declines, though, there were also forecasts of a dollar collapse. Many countries considered removing their currency pegs from the dollar, but there was no real substitute for the dollar as a global currency. So, of course, the collapse never happened. I find it extremely disheartening when looking through social media platforms like YouTube and Facebook, Twitter, and so on, and you see all of these so-called truthers talking about the dollar collapse. But in reality, between the years of 2014 and 2016, the dollar rose in value by a whopping 25%. Something else that people really need to take a look at are all of the strange insinuations that somehow or another the euro is going to take over. And when it happens, it's going to cause this massive collapse. If indeed the euro does shift, and if it occurs at all, it would happen extremely slowly. And this is because of something called the Eurozone crisis. It actually forced the EU to realize that it must become a fiscal and governmental union if it wants to continue its monetary union. Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel, wants this to happen, but other members are very cautious. Germany's domination during World War II is too recent of a memory. The European Union's progress towards its monumental undertaking will determine the future strength of the euro in comparison to the dollar. However, right now, the global currency is the US dollar, and any takeover of that would have to happen very, very slowly. While I'm on this subject, I want to talk about something that has really started to bother me about looking on social media and seeing a lot of the titles that have to do with putting us back on gold standard. It tells me that a lot of people really have absolutely no idea about the economy at all. One of the major reasons that the United States abandoned the so-called gold standard is that there is nothing standard about the price of gold. Whenever you see the words gold standard, always remember to substitute the words as gold variable instead. It much more accurately describes the entire idea. The U.S. abandoned the gold standard in large part because the Soviet Union was the world's leading producer of gold, followed by South Africa, and neither of these nations were on friendly terms with the United States at the time. These nations could have wreaked havoc with the U.S. economy by alternatively withholding or flooding gold from the marketplace. Staying on the gold standard, or gold variable as we're referring to it, would have meant abandoning control of the value of the dollar to rivals and enemies of the United States at the time. As it is, currently the value of the dollar is set largely on the strength and productivity of the United States economy. The supply of money has some effect, but not in the way most people think that it does. We live in a modern age right now where most dollars are never printed. They are added to bank accounts on computers when people get paid for work. Then they are moved to other places when people pay for things. Digital dollars are always being created and destroyed in the system. They are not each attached to some note printed in a treasury or some ounce of gold in Fort Knox. Interest is earned, stock value created and lost, trades made, and currencies converted without paper or precious metal ever being involved at all. The dollar is no longer a physical thing that can be contained and controlled. The Federal Reserve can apply the brakes to a dollar creation by manipulating lending, but it does not control the supply by printing actual dollars. There is no gold standard because the price of gold is not standard. Going back to gold standard would be disastrous because it would open the United States of America up to currency manipulation that could destroy the economy and send the country into a very deep depression. There are many, many people that are out there talking about fiat currency. Fiat currency is considered currency that is not backed by some commodity like gold, silver, or bushels of corn. They go on about how the nation's economies were destroyed by printing endless amounts of fiat currency, making each banknote printed worth less until all of the notes out there became worthless. And you know what? They're absolutely correct. And I could give you examples from the past where this was true and actually happened. However, that horse left the barn decades ago. The U.S. Federal Reserve banks no longer create most of the actual dollars that are in circulation. When Apple stock goes from $26 per share to $126 per share, nobody prints extra dollars in order to represent that wealth that's created, but it exists. The stock exchanges don't say, well, we have to drop the price of IBM and Microsoft in order to make up for the gains that are at Apple. It is not a zero-sum game. We have gone well beyond the quaint ideas of gold standards and fiat currency. However, gold standards were never standard either. The value of gold depended on, in part, supply and demand, just like fiat currencies do, and, in part, fear, greed, and emotions. If people had little fear and were comfortable that the price of gold was stable or reduce, then the price of gold would be stable or reduce, regardless of the supply. But when people are fearful and insecure, then the price of gold rises regardless of supply. So the post-fiat non-gold standard US dollar is based on the same variables that the value of gold has always been based on. It is just that the United States of America is in control of the variables. If the US is doing well, then the dollar is very strong, regardless of how much gold gets dumped on the market. Of course, if the US happens to screw up its economy, then the dollar does poorly. The economic crisis in the 1970s and 80s were happening when the first world countries were going through the transition from commodity-based currencies to fiat to post-fiat currencies. And I'm sure some economist out there has a name for whatever it is that we call this post-fiat based currency. To many people, it seems like phony money, and they talk about that regularly. But the value of gold was just as phony and made up as the value of currency today. It's money. It's not real. It's honestly something that we've made up. Now, others have addressed the what would happen problems. And it seems to me, after researching some of this, that most of the attraction to the gold standard is that the dollar at that point would represent an actual physical thing rather than being a completely fictional abstraction. Some call fiat currency a sort of Ponzi scheme, and I guess to some extent they are right. A dollar is only worth something because you believe that somebody else will accept it in trade. But guess what? So is gold. Gold as of June 12th, 2017, costed about $1,265 per ounce. What is it worth? Gold is used for several things. Contacts on electronic devices, the gold-colored bits on the plugs of some electronics, including printer cartridges. There are often actually a thin layer of gold because gold is excellent for that purpose. The amount used in each of those contacts is very tiny. There are other similar uses that are entirely practical. Since gold is actually purchased through those things, it must be worth at least the current cost. But if gold were only used for those things, the demand would be so much lower. So the cost would be as well. This use is entirely a usable commodity value. This is gold purely as real stuff. Gold is used in jewelry, partly because it has a look that many people like and partly because it is a symbol of wealth. There are perfectly good, relatively inexpensive substitutes for the look of gold, other than for a small number of people who are sensitive to the metals and they need gold studs, for example, to wear as earrings because they're allergic to other things. But they don't represent wealth then. When gold is used in this context, most of its value, the difference between the gold version and the similar looking substitute, is not intrinsic to the material. The value is a marker for wealth. Gold is used in religious contexts, partly because of the fact that gold, pure gold, does not corrode in natural circumstances. So it represents purity and incorruptibility, ironically enough. Partly because of the appearance, but I think mostly as a sacrifice of wealth. Again, a significant part of the value is not the material as such, but the wealth it represents. Gold is used as a hedge against inflation. When the value of a currency goes down, the value of gold tends to go up relative to that currency. The price of gold tends to rise over time. So some people buy it in hopes of somebody else buying it from them for more. This is almost the most literal Ponzi-ness of gold. If you want to talk about a Ponzi scheme, the gold standard was a great one. I hope everyone enjoyed number 10. I hope everyone has learned something from number 10, the United States dollar has no real value, because in reality, the United States dollar has a great real value, global currency. If you really start researching this, you will find that a lot of the people that are putting out information with regards to the US dollar being a Ponzi scheme or the US dollar being not real in some form or the gold standard being better, when you really dig into that, you're going to find it's not accurate. And although our system is not perfect with the US dollar currently, It's the closest thing that we have. All right, everyone. I hope everybody has a great day and tune in for number 9. Bye-bye.